Thursday, October 3rd. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. We are taking a look at the top international headlines of the week from the Middle East to U.S. politics, and we're asking, how are you affected by these stories? I've got a couple of guests here to wade through it all with us to talk about why they matter, what it may mean for the world, and for us here. Yeah, it's not often we dip into the international side of things here on The Signal, but there's so much going on. I just thought, you know what, for Thursday, let's have a call-in show, and we'll ask folks how they're affected by these big international stories. And for some of you, it may, like, I know me, sometimes I turn it off, and you might be doing that with your radio right now. But if you do stick with us and you want to learn a little bit about what's on the go this week and get some context and analysis, I've got a couple of great guests I'm going to introduce shortly. I'm just looking at... Let me say, CBC World. Here, I'm going to go through some of the top headlines. This will set the stage for some of the conversation today. So for CBC, on our World News page, top headline, Israel launches airstrike in central Beirut as clashes with Hezbollah fighters continue. Going down, it's Hezbollah militants, Israeli soldiers engaged in deadly fighting inside Lebanon. This man's son, killed in Iran's attack on Israel, was waiting for a ceasefire in Gaza to return home. Scroll down a little bit more. Trump acted outside his duties in pressuring Pence officials after 2020 election loss, according to prosecutors. New York Times, top stories. Israel says at least 8 soldiers are killed in clashes with Hezbollah. Under analysis, a wider war in the Middle East from Hamas to Hezbollah and now Iran. Also, stranded in North Carolina's mountains. You can't tell that the world's going on. So this is obviously about the aftermath of Helene. So we've got the Middle East, U.S. politics. We just had the vice presidential debate. You've got that massive hurricane that kept going over land and the states and the aftermath of that. Plus, there's still obviously Ukraine, and there's more going on to talk about. So joining me here in studio, welcome back to both of you. So we've got Lucian Ashworth, Memorial University poli-sci prof, and according to your X handle, I guess, Twitter handle, purveyor of fine international relations, the history of international thought, a specialty.
Absolutely. Nice to be here.
Thanks for coming back. And Justin Fentuso, Memorial University history prof as well, an expert on the modern Middle East. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Adam.
All right. So that, like I said, folks, the lines are open. If you've got thoughts, if you want to talk about just how you're affected by these stories, right? When do you take times to listen, read, watch them? Do you turn them off? What are your thoughts around them? Give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. You can text us, 709-327-8206, or email thesignal@cbc.ca. So those are the headlines that I was looking at, guys, right? The last week or two, what have you guys been following? Justin, we'll start with you.
I think, like most people, what the situation is looking like with Iran and with Israel in particular.
Yeah.
Obviously, about a week ago, everybody kind of was watching southern Lebanon and wondering, will the Israelis go in or not? They haven't been there since they evacuated southern Lebanon in 2000. Another brief month-long war in 2006, but no permanent occupation force there at all. So this is the first time in a long time the Israelis decided to put boots on the ground in southern Lebanon. That was kind of capturing my attention a week ago. And then obviously as the story unfolded, the airstrikes, Iran's response a couple of days ago, for me, the focus kind of shifted to, okay, is this the confrontation that we've all been kind of, looking at for maybe 2 decades now and hoping to avoid, but are we at the point now where Iran and Israel are actually going to confront each other?
And what will that mean? What will things look like afterwards? And the ramifications around all that.
Absolutely.
Luke, what about yourself?
Obviously. We're looking at all the stuff in the Levant, around Lebanon and Gaza, but also a few other things going on too. We've got continuing fighting in Ukraine, and there seem to be developments there. The ramping up of the Russian war economy. They're now spending a lot more on their defense than they were. Also, massive inflation in Russia as a result. We've got elections in Georgia. And this month we've got the biodiversity COP16 meeting in Colombia. And we've got November COP29 on climate change. And one bit of good news story that was out today, agreement between Britain and the Maldives solving the problem of the Chagos Islands, which has been an ongoing irritant and an ongoing issue of the international law courts. So that's been solved. So one problem's been solved.
One thing has been solved. Hey, it's nice.
Diplomacy can work.
Diplomacy works, yeah.
Diplomacy works. Yeah, it's. Thank you for bringing one good news thing, because sometimes it sure is a fire hose these days, right? With everything going on. And I will look, folks. I will say, as we're going to be picking through a lot of these international stories through the next 50 minutes or so. These stories talk about loss of life. It's been thousands, tens of thousands in some cases. Obviously, this is very serious. It is hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. But nonetheless, this is what's happened. And I just want to recognize that as we start into this conversation, that there's a lot of people in a lot of pain around the world with these stories we're talking about. Justin, from you, we're coming, today's the 3rd, right? So we're coming up on the 7th in just a few days.
We are, yeah.
Can we get a little recap of what happened and where we are, where we've moved to? And I know you could spend probably days talking about that, but just something half succinct.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, coming up on about a year ago, we had Hamas's attacks on Israel, a number of kibbutzim, small, mostly agricultural communities along the southwestern border of Israel and the Gaza Strip. Those Hamas attacks ended up killing about 1,200 Israelis, most of whom were civilians. Some were military members as well, but most of them were civilians. And about 250 or so Israelis were dragged back into the Gaza Strip and held as hostages. We have a pretty good consensus, I think, now that the impetus for that attack, the motivation behind it, everyone was wondering in the days when it happened, why did this happen? Why did they decide to launch this attack now? I think there's pretty widespread consensus now that this was an effort orchestrated in coordination with Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon to derail the normalization talks that were going on between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I mean, that was going to be a game changer politically in the region in terms of power dynamics, who was on whose side, obviously kind of setting up something of a U.S.-led coalition of moderate Arab states in Israel against Iran and its proxy groups, which we all kind of have heard about now for the last year: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shiite militia groups in Iraq. The next day, after the October 7th attacks last year, Hezbollah in Lebanon started firing rockets at Israel, and over the last nearly 12 months now, they've fired up around 8,000 projectiles at Israel, mostly the northern parts of Israel. That led to an evacuation of about 60,000, 70,000 Israelis from the north of Israel who are still displaced. And over the last year, we've seen, incredibly destructive firepower brought down on Gaza in Israel's attempt to destroy Hamas. And then the situation's escalated a bit in the last week with the move into southern Lebanon and the involvement of Iran.
Yeah, I was in preparing for the show today. I was looking at some recent CBC coverage, and part of it was from under a story from last week saying Gaza health authorities list more than 41,000 Palestinians confirmed killed in an assault, which Israel launched after the Hamas-led fighters attacked on October 7th, like you just mentioned. And then the other bits through the year, you've had as well, and correct me on any of this, but in March, UN expert on genocide allegations in the UN, saying rights expert finds reasonable grounds genocide is being committed in Gaza. Israel, meanwhile, strongly denying charges of genocide at the UN, telling that they're doing the most it can to protect the civilian population during its military operations. Yeah.
That sounds about right. It's been a highly contentious issue, obviously provoking protests across mostly the Western world to, kind of motivate, pressure the two sides, Hamas and Israel, to reach some kind of ceasefire to avoid further civilian loss of life, and also damaged infrastructure as well. I mean, the Gaza Strip now, if you look at pictures of it or you see videos of it, it invokes shades of, Dresden, northern Germany, 1944, 1945. 100%. I mean, it's gone, right?
That's what it like so much so. I was looking at just the other day, right? Pictures, and those were the thoughts, right? Looking at the aftermath of those, whether it's the fire bombings, same with on the Japan side with the Tokyo fire bombings too. That's the only thing I've seen that kind of matches that type of a thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's no exaggeration. It's not hyperbolic at all to say that the air campaign that Israel has waged, both on Gaza and recently last week on southern Lebanon, in 10, 15, 20 years, these are going to be talked about as historically significant air campaigns. What states can or cannot do with aerial bombing, how they can kind of try to force diplomatic issues with the use of air power. I think these are going to kind of take a place in the history of modern air warfare.
I want to bring us back for a second. And folks, here, I'll put up the numbers again. So today we're talking about international headlines, right? From the Middle East, U.S. politics, climate change, Ukraine, you name it. How are you affected by these stories? Give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. Text us, 709-327-8206. Emails thesignal@cbc.ca. You're just listening to modern Middle East expert, Memorial University history professor Justin Ventuso. Lucian Ashworth is also here, poli-sci prof, international relations specialist. I want to go back to 2002 for a second, guys. I was on my run yesterday evening and listened to a podcast, and this was brought up because they were talking about just what we're talking about now, right? From the Middle East. Back in 2002, President Bush, George W. Bush, and here's the news headline. President Bush has condemned the Israeli airstrike in Gaza that resulted in the deaths of the leader of the Islamic militant group Hamas and 14 other Palestinians, including 9 children. The president said he's concerned that the Israelis hit a building knowing innocent people would likely be killed. So 14 people killed. And then this concern gets issued. This is 2002, and I will note, less than a year later, the invasion of Iraq happens, and that's 2003 to 2011, right? So there's a lot of context to think about for former President Bush's thoughts and opinion there, given what happened afterwards. But how different of a time are we in now when I just read a number of 41,000 Palestinians killed, also the mentioning of 1,200 killed on October 7th, when 14 was a number that would issue that kind of a response from the President of the United States?
Well, 2002 was a different time, I mean, both politically and diplomatically for the Middle East, and in particular, how you want to contextualize that strike and Bush Jr.'s comments. At that time, we were kind of coming off of diplomatic attempts between the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ehud Barak, and Clinton first, then George W. Bush. To reach a negotiation for a two-state solution. I mean, really close, really close in 2001, 2002 to getting that kind of diplomatic solution that might have ended the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the loss of civilian life, really of any scale at that time, it could have been 5, it could have been 14, it could have been 50, and I think Bush would have probably come out with a similar assessment.
Do what you can to keep peace.
Exactly, right? Like, don't escalate, don't flare up the situation. We're so close, and it's those kinds of civilian casualties that really can throw a wrench in those diplomatic processes, not just because it obviously creates a problem on the Palestinian side where they then have to look at their own population and kind of feed off of the public pressure they're getting to do something or not, but it also causes problems for the wider Arab world and how they participate in that peace process as well. We've seen that over the last 12 months. I mean, pressure from Qatar, pressure from the Saudis, what involvement does Egypt have? The more moderate states that usually fall in line with American policy or at least try to coordinate with it. The loss of civilian life has been a major problem for them and how they want to move forward with reconstructing Gaza afterwards and what relationship they'll have with Israel.
Luke, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is a different period. I think something else to bear in mind as well on this is the changes in Israeli politics. I mean, we're talking, about there was a functioning left of center in the Knesset in 2002. We're now looking at an Israeli politics which has moved sharply to the right. And also the role of the settler movement as well. So that's sort of one change that to sort of bear in mind. And I think the other one is, the long period, and, we can have a long discussion about, the sharing out where the blame lies on this, but we've had a long period of stalled peace negotiations. It really is, in many respects, a crying shame, given the the post-Oslo agreement, that period in the 1990s, early 2000s, when there really was a sense that some kind of permanent peace could be established. That's now well and truly gone. And what takes its place, I think, is the big question.
Absolutely. And I think Luke brings up a great point here, in particular about the kind of Israeli government you had in 2002, the kind of Israeli government you now have in 2023, 2024. This is an Israeli government, and I think increasingly an Israeli population that has had enough, rightly or wrongly, has had enough of trying to tolerate threats on the border, whether that's Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether that's Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip, whether that's radical elements as they would see them in the West Bank, Houthis in Yemen, and so on and so forth. I think this is an Israeli government that, especially in the aftermath of October 7th last year, no longer has a tolerance for these kinds of threats. And I think there's a great stat here that really bears out how there's some synergy now between this more right of center, you might even say hawkish government, or at least more willing to take kind of drastic military action and what the population thinks. A recent study by Tel Aviv University done just in the last few days puts the Israeli population's approval rating for the military at 87%. I mean, in terms of polling, I mean, that's pretty well universal consent to what the military is doing. So the way that the Israeli military is prosecuting this war has a lot of support right now in Israel.
I was listening to a piece for the New York Times on the Daily, their daily podcast, just September 18th. Israel's existential threat from within, the growing sway of far-right settlers in the West Bank has pushed Israeli politics toward a crisis. Just put that out there, folks, if you're looking for some really interesting background on this. It was quite the listen. This is The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. We're asking you today, when it comes to big international stories, right? The Middle East, U.S. politics, climate change, the war in Ukraine. How are you affected by these stories? If you've got thoughts for us, give us a call, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. Text us, 709-327-8206. The Signal at CBC for your emails. We've got Michael Boyle on the line from St. John's. Thanks for your call.
Good afternoon, Adam. A great show, interesting show that has to be talked about. And how are we affected? I think there's different ways, different people. But I think one way is that some people want to tune out. Yeah. They see the horror that's going on, and I realize it's not an easy situation in the Middle East to sort of comprehend for the average person. But I think a couple of things do emerge. And one of them is, first of all, I want to mention that, that the Hamas attack, last year was a dreadful event. There's no question about that. However, having said that, I want to make it absolutely clear to all the listeners all over Newfoundland, Labrador, and all over the world that the response to that attack was not proportionate. Not proportionate in any shape or form, with the number of casualties, seeing people, schools being destroyed. And, it's an elephant in the room. Our churches, our governments, and even the media, take the party line. Take the party line of the Joe Biden sort of lack of a backbone to stand up. I'd like to know, or two guests to know, the role that Biden has played without having that backbone to stand up to Netanyahu. I think there could have been some kind of a deal made with the hostages before Christmas. So I'd like to hear, the role of Joe Biden and the, sort of support Israel at all costs, regardless.
Michael, thanks for that. I'll put it to the guests. Appreciate your thoughts and your call on this. And you're helping me pace the show along nicely because that was...
I'm not finished yet.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead with part two, sir. Sorry.
No, I want to hear the guests and then I'll come back.
Okay, perfect. We'll keep you on the line. Go ahead, guys. So thoughts on, just because me and you talked about this in prep for the show yesterday, right?
Yeah, we did. So I think there's kind of... I'll address Michael's question here in two ways, and it's a great question, Michael. The first thing I'm going to address really, really quickly is actually this issue of proportionality. I think us outside of the region see this in terms of proportionality, but I don't think the Israeli government does. Or I don't think they any longer consider proportionality a consideration that they need to think about. Proportionality, at what point do we say that the kind of tit for tat nature of it is sufficient, right? Is it 1,200 for you, 1,200 for us, and we call it a day? Proportionality is a really, really difficult question to answer. It's a good question to raise. It's a very difficult question to answer. As it relates to Joe Biden and the U.S., I don't know if I'd say that it's support at all costs. I know it definitely looks that way. I get entirely where Michael's coming from. There's been a lot of behind-the-scenes shuttle diplomacy from the Americans to put a lot of pressure on Israel. For example, in Israel, when the Iranians launched their first missile strike, the cruise missiles and drones, the 300 or so of them in April, the Israelis wanted to respond more forcefully then. And it was the Biden administration that put enough pressure on them to back down, take the win, as Biden said, and to not retaliate. I do think, to Michael's point, though, that what we are starting to see here a little bit, or I'll spin Michael's question a bit, we are starting to see a situation in which American influence and American pressure on Israel only goes so far now, right? Israel, I don't think, is any longer willing to make decisions that are not in their national self-interest or what they perceive to be their self-interest or national security, just because the Americans tell them to.
What happens if they shut off the arms that they're shipping over, though?
So that gets complicated as well, because a lot of those arms agreements are also with private contractors, right? So there's issues there with what the American government can do.
It's kind of wild when you frame it that way.
It is. But the key point here, I think, is Israel also has a domestic arms manufacturing industry that they could rely on or ramp up. And the United States are not the only arms provider to Israel. Czechia, the formerly known as the Czech Republic, is a major contributor of arms. Germany as well. Britain ships arms, although they've recently had conversations about pausing or stopping those arms shipments. Israel also has increasingly strong allies in South America, Paraguay, Argentina, especially Argentina, a country that produces a lot of arms. So the Americans, if they shut off that tap, I mean, that's where most of the arms are coming from. But I imagine Israel would simply pivot in some way. It would cause some temporary disruption, but I think Israel could figure it out.
Luke, anything to add there?
I suppose just one point to add, again, going into the Israeli internal politics, is, of course, this was an exceedingly unpopular coalition government going in to the 7th of October attacks. And it remains quite strongly unpopular. So we've got a government that's acting to sort of save its life, and what it's doing to its neighbors has a lot more to do, I think, with internal Israeli politics and what will happen there. And on that, I mean, this is a big question, and I don't necessarily have answers. I'm trying to sort of form ideas about this, but looking as as an outsider to this conflict, and I'm looking at Israeli's strategy, and I agree with Justin. There's in fact, this proportionality doesn't seem to be an issue. But I wonder, what actually are the achievable goals of the Israeli government? That's not clear. What is the exit strategy of the Israeli government? That's not clear. And the kind of the policy of counter-terror, if you like, for want of a better phrase, to remove the threat to Israel as they perceive it. That kind of counter-terror only works really, if you're a Stalin, if you're able to go the whole hog, which Israel can't. It's in the glare of international publicity, but also they can't for their own domestic market as well, their own domestic constituency. So, I'm left with this issue of sort of wondering, what actually does the Israeli government expect to get out of this, if at all? Or are they not thinking like that? And maybe Justin has some ideas on this one, because I don't have a firm answer.
Well, we'll pin that, and we'll go back to Richard, and then we'll go back to Justin. Richard, part two or follow-ups to anything happening with, thanks to your first question.
Regarding the, playgrounds, think of our playgrounds in Newfoundland. Bully boys. Bullies. We don't like bullies, do we? Do we like bullies? Do we tolerate bullies in the classroom? Do we tolerate bullies in our street? Are we complicit? And is the media complicit? And I don't mean you, Adam, personally. But you look at the media. You look at the mainstream media. You begin to wonder, that everybody's all on side, And I think Luke described it. The Israeli politics, in a sense that Netanyahu is before the start of this war, he was no hero. And once the war is over, I think duck.
Michael, you cut out there for a second. Just repeat the last bit if you could.
Yeah, I think once this war is over, why it continues on with Netanyahu, he's back in court.
Yeah. So questions around. Your phone's going in and out, so you might be getting a call.
Yeah. Well, I think I better hang up and let somebody else. Come on. But I think the point is made clear of people standing up. We saw it before. People standing up and being counted in the sense of hiding behind. And it's, I know it's difficult questions. And I thank the guests and you for bringing this up. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, and thanks for your question.
Michael,
Thanks, Michael
Boyle, thanks for the call from St. John's there. Before we go to our next caller, do you want to follow up on any thoughts, Justin, from...
So I think Luke is absolutely right that there's obviously an internal political dimension to this as well, right? I mean, and Michael brought this up as well. The issue of Netanyahu's, the corruption charges, the attempts to, modify the judiciary, the Supreme Court in particular, and curtail its powers in Israel. And there's been a lot of questions in Israel and here in the West. If you're reading widely enough, you'll see that there's enough questions of it in the West as well about whether or not Netanyahu has been, prolonging the war or conducting aspects of the war in a way that, keeps him in power, keeps him, keeps his butt in the prime minister's seat. I don't know if the IDF, if the Israel Defense Forces would actually tolerate that, frankly. I don't know if they would engage in certain military policies that were clearly to them, political. Subtly political or explicitly political. I don't know if they would do that. I mean, at the end of the day, they take their orders from the Israeli government, right? But I don't think they would put Israeli soldiers in harm's way or conduct operations that would be overtly for political reasons. And I think they're smart enough to know if they are or not. Now, again, I mean, the issue of Biden and the issue of the Americans and what they can and cannot do, it's a really, really tricky question, right? It's a really, really tricky question, and the answer is evolving all the time right now.
And do you see any difference for the November American election for the two possible kind of outcomes from that? Like, is there a difference there? Because I know when we talk in a bit about Ukraine, there's a bigger conversation around that.
I think if Trump wins, whatever handcuffs are on the Israelis right now will clearly be off.
Yeah.
But I'm not so sure there are many handcuffs on the Israelis now anyways, right?
Yeah.
So, you might see more of a public-facing change of attitude and what the Israelis are allowed to do. Trump's, a lot more vocal and a lot more kind of colloquial with what he'll say about the situation in the Middle East. I'm sure he'll say, the Israelis got to do what they got to do. They got to go in and they got to clean up the mess and mop it up. And these are terrorists and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure from a policy perspective, the American approach to Israel will change that much if we move to a Trump presidency from a Biden presidency. As Michael pointed out, I mean, the Biden presidency has been by and large full support behind Israel, right? So I don't see a whole lot changing other than maybe the public language of the White House.
You're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today we are taking a look at some of the top international headlines of the week. We don't do this very often, but today we are. We're talking everything from the Middle East to U.S. politics, climate change, Ukraine, and we're asking, how are you affected by these stories? 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255 are the numbers. You can text us, 709-327-8206, The Signal at cbc.ca. Richard North is on the line from St. John's. Richard, thank you for calling.
Hi, how are you today, sir?
Good. How you doing?
Great. Beautiful topic. I'm glad you brought it up because closer to home in regards to your topic, I really got to the point in my life where I cannot and will not sit down anymore and listen to CNN or any of the other stations regarding our neighbors to the south because I'm a bit of I like to think, an armchair historian, and I see history almost repeating itself with regards to Trump and his policies. Now, I don't want to get on your program to talk about him in particular, but it's frightening what's going on in the United States of America when it's been said that if he gets elected, there'll be no more elections. That's disconcerting to me, and it should be to Canada, and for that matter, the world.
Yeah, look, there's lots of concern expressed by experts the world over on the health of the democracy of the United States of America and what the ramifications, the implications of this next election will be for them. And also, that whole sleeping next to an elephant line, right, for us here, to quote the first Trudeau.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And I think this month of October is turning to me, at least to me, maybe I'm paranoid, I don't know, is getting to be a very anxious month because within the next few weeks, the world could take a change for the better or for the worse, depending on the United States policies and United States politics.
Yeah, no, and like that anxiety, I find that conversation is in a lot of places where I go when I'm outside of work, right? I can meet up with friends and like there is a lot of fear and anxiety around the news these days, right? And because it's serious stuff, we're obviously, right? We're talking about loss of life. We're talking about health of democracy. We're talking like there's a lot there. So any other thoughts, Richard, before I let you go?
No, I don't mean to hold up you. I just, my final thought is that, please God, that it doesn't turn out the way I kind of think that it may. But anyway, great topic, guys, and great show. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Richard. All right, we've got a couple more callers to get to. If you want to join the conversation, though, we're asking how big international news stories affect you. The numbers to call here on The Signal with me, Adam Walsh, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. Text us 709-327-8206. Email us thesignal@cbc.ca. Luke, just any thoughts on what Richard was saying there?
Yeah, no, I do remember a line comes to me from, I forget who said it now, but directly after the 2016 election when Trump first won. Someone mentioned that America has picked a really bad time to stress test its democracy. And, I often feel about this because, I mean, in some respects, you can be both pessimistic and optimistic here. On the pessimistic side, you can see, the challenging to election results because it's a kind of a basic thing in elections that in a democracy, the losing party concedes and then
peaceful transfer of power.
Peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah.
And when you're one of the vice presidential candidates can't even bring himself to say that there's been fair elections, of course that's worrying. Although, I mean, on a sort of a more kind of positive note, the American democratic machinery, the American rule of law, it has frayed edges, but it's also remarkably resilient. I mean, it's survived since it survived 2016.
Mm-hmm. The system corrected itself.
The system, you could put it that way if you want to be a sort of servo mechanism. Yeah. So on the one hand, I think our caller called it right. There are reasons to be worried, but at the same time, there are also whenever talking about the US is I think I quoted this to you, Adam. It's sort of like everything you've heard about the US is true and its opposite. Yeah, which is also not original with me. It's someone's line on it, which I thought really explains the US very well, is that yes, there are threats to democracy, but the American system also has a certain amount of resilience to it as well. So right to be worried, but I think also, we don't have to be too worried.
I appreciate the glass half full perspective there, Luke.
It's all I can offer you.
I'll kind of relate that actually to the topic we're kind of focusing on today as well, which is the Middle East, and to also kind of ring on a note of optimism from Luke, which is very helpful in these times. Like him or hate him, respect the regime, so to speak, or not, the administration. The Trump administration last time, if we find ourselves in another one, made significant progress in diplomatic negotiations in the Middle East. The Abraham Accords were truly a historic development. So even if a Trump administration returns to the helm as far as the Middle East is concerned, that's not necessarily a call for pessimism. And that's not to say that the Biden administration hasn't tried as hard as they have, but that is to say that either administration has shown themselves capable of getting real hard diplomatic work done in the region. So there is still some hope for optimism there. Yeah, and like the State Department, regardless of whoever is president, continues to function with people who've been working for a long period of time, right? That's right, and it's always been an American policy, since really the late 1970s anyways, to advance a two-state solution. I mean, even under the Trump administration, that was still the declared policy. Despite, some decisions made by that government, like moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, somewhat inflammatory, but the policy always remained a two-state
Two-state
solution. And I don't think that would change under a successive Trump administration or, whatever other kind of government we might see.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think, but be much more worried about the lack of a consensus over Ukraine. And over,
that's a great point.
Over NATO, but the example of the Abraham Accords is a good example.
Yeah, some definite big NATO questions if it goes one way as opposed to the other. There, we've got Dick Whitaker on the line from Portugal Cove. Hi, sir.
Hi, how are you today?
Good. How you doing?
Oh, I'm hanging in there. I'm trying to avoid going out in the cold for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, July will be back in no time.
Yeah. I took a bit of time to look up the Jewish diaspora in the world, and these are things that people don't talk about or I think understand, but there are about a little less than 16 million worldwide, at least listed on the internet. Israel has 7 million of them plus. The U.S. has nearly 6 million. So between the two of them, that's roughly 13 million out of 15 and a bit, that sort of thing. So, when you think about that, it's understandable that, that the survival and so forth is focused on those two countries really in a strong way. Canada has about 400,000 or something of that sort. So, and France has about that. And between these four countries, that's the bulk of the worldwide Jewish population. So, you can see why there is a need to try and sort things, and nobody's been able to do it. As it stands right now, it's becoming Fortress Israel. Well, it is Fortress Israel. Call it what you like, and it's going to be more so unless after, this current round of things going on between there and Lebanon and so forth, unless there is a backing off of the countries surrounding a bit, enabling the possibility of a two-state situation, we're going to be in this for a long, long, long time. The other same problem is obviously Ukraine in this respect, and these wars are also adding to the climate issue. People don't talk about that, but they are. All this stuff getting blown up, and obviously the burning stuff that's going on. The manufacture of weapons and all that adds to climate change, as well as the things that are going on. And we're not coping with climate change, and it's distracting from our real need, which is to get on with, really pushing climate change back if it's possible. It's not very, very, very reassuring when you think about it. The distractions are too great. I'll just leave it like that and see what you have to say about this.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks for the call.
All right.
Dick Whitaker, Portugal Cove. Couple of points there, right? What do you guys think?
Yeah. Well, I think some good points there made about the effect of war directly on issues like pollution. There was one of the Ukrainian rivers, looks like it might have been deliberate, but heavily polluted by the war, and the Ukrainians calling it ecocide, but also even kind of indirectly the distraction. And what we're talking about here, I often feel when I'm looking at these major events that are in the immediate term, killing thousands of people. Yet we're kind of facing long-term existential threats like biodiversity, like climate change, that of course will threaten in the longer term millions, if not billions, of people. So there is this kind of issue that there's things we really need to do. And I think, just quickly, one of the things that when I teach my End of the World course, Global Politics at the End of the World, one of the things I point out there is the people who study collapse of societies is that human societies are great problem-solving mechanisms. and they can handle one problem, maybe two at a time, in terms of existential threats. But when your existential threats start going up to 3 or 4 or 5, that's when societies get overwhelmed and collapse. And we've got a lot of problems building up. So that is that's a concern and that's a worry. Even though actually we have the ability to solve these problems, the ability is there. We just need, in many respects, just the political will.
I'll take on kind of two of the points that were made there. I think the first one, kind of about the Jewish diaspora in North America, Western Europe, France in particular. I'll read between the lines a little bit. I mean, what we're talking about here is the pro-Israel lobby, right? That's how we kind of connect the diaspora to the support of Israel. I understand why, and there's a grain of truth, obviously, in what's being said here. I understand why people kind of look at that. Particularly in the United States, there's a very strong pro-Israel lobby, obviously. And as Luke knows, this has been a matter of really intense academic debate over the last 20, 25 years. I would caution people, though, to not put too much stock into how the pro-Israel lobby actually affects government policy. I don't think the Americans would ever, and I don't think there's really any evidence of this. And if you read a lot of the kind of behind-the-scenes books that have been written by former diplomats, special envoys, negotiators, especially tied to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, at no time do any of them or did any of them feel like the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, which would be the largest one, the diaspora there. No time did they ever feel like that lobby exerted enough pressure to change the government policy line or to change what they were trying to achieve in a negotiation. Obviously, does it lobby on behalf of Israel? Of course it does. In the same way that many Arab American communities lobby on behalf of the Palestinian cause, particularly in places like Michigan. But does it have real power to affect government policy lines? I think that's a really, really difficult conclusion to draw. As for the issue he raised about Israel's neighbors, no question. It's a really difficult situation for Israel to be in when all of its neighbors are basically unstable. Syria has been in the midst now of a 13-year-long civil war. Lebanon is, I think we can all agree, a failed state. There is no state, obviously, in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and we've seen what's come out of the Gaza Strip over the last year with Hamas. The only real partner regionally are the other two Arab states on Israel's borders, which are Egypt and Jordan, and which happen to be the two countries they have peace treaties with and full diplomatic relations.
Before I go to our next caller, just for some extra context of Iran, Hezbollah, and Syria, and Assad.
Sure, yeah, and it's a great question, and it's not something that gets talked about very often. They're in the Iranian forward defense view. Everything we see with the Iranian proxy groups and the kind of conflict we've been seeing play out over the last year and even long before that, all of this is an Iranian strategy and effort to push the fight away from Iran's borders and onto its proxy groups, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Strip, Houthis in Yemen. But also increasingly since 2011, the Iranians threw their weight behind the embattled President Bashar al-Assad, whose regime does not share religious ties with Iran or even political ties. He's a Ba'athist, the Syrian Ba'ath Party, which was a secular, or still is, a secular socialist political party. But the Iranians threw their weight behind the Syrian president for one very clear reason. To ship arms to Hezbollah in Lebanon, you need Syria open. And that's why we saw Hezbollah also take part and continues to take part in the Syrian civil war, fighting on behalf of the regime. This is why when Hassan Nasrallah was killed later last week, you saw certain Syrians in Syria actually celebrating his death. Because he, as the general secretary of Hezbollah, sent his group into there, and Hezbollah commanders were accused of conducting countless massacres in Syria of civilian populations. So there's a relationship between Iran and Syria, mostly to do with how Iran can ship arms to its proxy groups.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing out that context, because you don't see it out there that often, like you're saying, and it is important just if we're trying to kind of think of the totality of everything that has been going on and some of the complexities around it. We've got Bert on the line from Mount Pearl. How you doing, Bert?
Doing good, Adam. How are you?
Good. Thoughts on how are you affected by international news stories? Thoughts on the conversation today?
Well, it might be taking a different route, Adam, but it's just my thoughts. And I got to be kind of simple and short with this whole thing. And because I've given up pretty well listening to the news and getting into that negative aspect of what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
And two things I like to try to add to my life. One is to be so grateful to living in this province, whether it's the weather, not complaining about it, or listening to politicians being so negative, and because the world is in such turmoil. But, Adam, the last point is we all feel powerless here in this country at what we can do.
Yeah.
And to me, there's one simple thing, because my heart goes out to the children. And if I can keep my heart together here, but, I sit here and I'm powerless. So what can I do? Well, there's one thing I can do, is to provide a little sum of money to organizations like UNAR, the United Nations Relief Fund, and make a little donation. I play a game of cards, and we say, okay, $5 each. We send $50 to that organization to help the hospitals and the children who are suffering. So I just want to leave it at that, Adam. And the last note, get rid of some of the men that we got running our countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bert.
Thanks, Adam.
Cheers. And I appreciate all of that. And yeah, that feeling, I understand it. I feel it, right? There's a lot going on in the world, and here we are in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it can feel, sometimes so far away, but also we've got diaspora populations here who are living it day by day as well, and it is a real impact on communities in this province, and also for folks who are not totally who don't have the familial connection to it. We still feel impacted by it. Anyone on what Bert was saying?
Well, I share his frustration.
Yeah.
I share the frustration, as a father of a near 2-year-old daughter as well right now. I mean, the situation is, there's no other way to put it. I mean, it's heartbreaking, right? I mean, no one wants to see the kind of civilian casualties that have been happening, whether that's in the Middle East or if it's in Ukraine or anywhere around the world. So, he has every right to be frustrated. I can empathize with him entirely. I hate to hear when these kinds of situations become so overwhelming that people just want to tune out. But I understand it. Right? But I do hope that people. And Bert's doing the best he can, like we all are. I do hope we still try to stay connected to those events because, as Bert just talked about, knowing about them, he can still make a decision to do what he thinks is right or is morally right in his situation, whatever he thinks he can do to help. And I think you need to know what you're trying to help in order to do that.
Well, and elections come around, right?
Sure.
And when it comes to elections, policy. Right, different parties have different policies.
Yeah, and
when
as Luke knows as well,
voting,
increasingly a lot of voters are single 2-issue voters, right? I mean, you're not necessarily voting on a whole platform. It's one or two things that maybe captivate you and make you, go one way or the other.
So the direction of a province, direction of a country, all of that ties together.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well is, we get bombarded on television with the worst. The Chagos good news today was a very small part of the news. You had to hunt around for it. But what I would say is, again, I think this it's the benefit of being around for a multiple number of decades was, my God, it was a lot worse in the early 80s. When I was an older teenager, when I found myself going to university for the first time, and in fact it turned out we almost had a nuclear war by accident in 1983.
Oh, the submarine bit?
Oh no, that was the 60s. This was the Soviet system which gave a warning.
That's right.
Stanislav Petrov, the colonel in charge, decided that this didn't feel right. His gut said turn the computer off, but we almost had a nuclear war.
That's kind of wild. It's like,
Yeah.
turn the computer off and on again to see if this is,
It's the only way to handle a computer.
It's the best tech advice there is. So there
Maybe
you
we
go.
need to do that with the world.
The firmest advice for the last 45 years. Like, have you tried turning it off and on?
Yeah.
Yeah, if this program tells anyone anything. But I think, it is easy to get overwhelmed. But the point is that all of these things that we're talking about, particularly when we're looking at the issue of, Western Asia, the Levant, the Middle East, these are all solvable, and they've come close to solutions as well. There is, a diplomatic track. I just my advice to people is, hang in there.
There's a way back.
There's
We've
a way
seen
back.
ways, like from World War One.
That's
World
right.
War
People
II.
in Vietnam aren't killing each other
Right.
anymore. The Vietnam War is over. There are ways out. Europe used to be the most dangerous place to live. There were wars there all the time. As you look at Europe at the moment, there's a lot of good news stories out there.
Man, like my in-laws were born just after the end of the Korean War. And I'm going to be going to South Korea actually end of next week. And like to go with pictures and to look back at 53, 54 and onward of what that was like. And, we're talking about Gaza now, and you look at some of the pictures from then. But then you go to South Korea now and you see like that country and the folks there and just how vibrant that place is. I mean, there is hope to be found in this world around in different places. As hard as everything is, and as impossible as it looks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as a historian as well, history moves on. Things change. So absolutely, there's always reason for optimism, both as it relates to Israel, Gaza, the wider war, Russia, Ukraine. I mean, there will be a solution at some point. It's a question of when. Time.
Usually, Krista, what are you either looking for or what are you thinking may or may not happen? We only have about 3 minutes left, but get your crystal balls out for either. Just let us know what's on your radar or what you think may happen in the coming months.
Yeah. Well, I think we're in the long haul for the Ukraine-Russia war. Yeah. But I think it'll end suddenly and very quickly. And I think a lot of it will revolve around changes in terms of attitudes within the Russian government. I think that's the key change. Or it could change because the Trump administration comes in. I don't know, but I think prepare for the long haul for Ukraine.
Well, as Trump is kind of infamously said now, right? I mean, a phone call and he can end it, right?
Yeah. So he claims.
10 years later, it's all just a phone call. It's all we need. I'm looking out for two things. I'm looking out for, how the situation between Israel and Iran continues to evolve, because that is a major potential conflict that could have ramifications for the region for decades. I mean, this could literally be the most pivotal moment in Middle East history in the last 50, 55 years. Could be. Might not be, but could be. And then I would continue to kind of watch what's going on in Israel and how much patience and tolerance the Israeli public has for fighting what is increasingly looking like a kind of sort of forever war.
Can I get one? We had one late email coming in here. Just with, like, it's hard to fit your answer into a minute here, but a big Alan emailed a big point that really gets discussed, and this is about he's saying that Israel is quote unquote an apartheid state due to the treatment of Palestinians. I'm wondering just if I could get a quick word from you just on that note.
So a very contentious issue that's hard to get out in 60 seconds. I think you have to distinguish between the territories and Israel proper.
Okay.
It would be my very short answer. The situation of Arab Israelis or Israeli Arabs, however you want to define them, in Israel proper is not the same as it is in the West Bank and as it is in Gaza. So I think you've got to differentiate between the two.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And Luke, last minute of the show, paying attention to COP coming up. Climate. We didn't talk a whole lot about climate change during this show, but I mean, this COP is it 29 coming up?
Yep, 29 in November. That's climate change. But really important is COP 16 in October this month on biodiversity. Biodiversity is the big crisis no one knows about.
All right, folks, there you go. You've got, if you want to responsibly hit your Google buttons for this COP for biodiversity to learn a little bit, and there's lots out there to learn. Guys, thank you so much for this conversation today.
No, thanks for having us. Have us again.
Yeah, this is good.
We can do it again. We can. We probably will.
Don't break up the team,
No, exactly. Get the dream team back together, folks. Lucian Ashworth, the Memorial University Poli-Sci Prof, International Relations expert, and also Justin Fantuzzo, Memorial University History Prof and expert on the modern Middle East. Thoughts on today's show? Give us an email. The Signal. I know the email. I don't even know why I had to read it. The Signal at cbc.ca. Get in touch with us anytime. And also we have the Signal line. You can leave a message, 709-576-5260. So that's it for today's show. Yes, it was very international news heavy. And I'm turning the car around. I'm driving in the other direction for tomorrow, as far away from headlines as possible, and I'm driving right into Trivia Town. Population U and other show listeners. My CBC colleague John Gushu will be my guest in his role as Trivia Master. The point of the hour is to have a bit of stress-free fun away from the headlines of the day. Plus, I just got a box of new The Signal ball caps, and one of you is going to win one of those at the end of tomorrow's show. We're going to draw names from a hat. Until tomorrow, thank you so much for listening, folks. Cheers.